They thought a single mom and an autistic man would be easy to erase. 30 days to disappear from the only place they'd ever felt safe. But when Daniel stood up in that room and spoke, his words didn't just freeze the corporate lawyers in their seats. They exposed a truth so uncomfortable that powerful people had no choice but to listen. What would you sacrifice to protect the one place where your brain doesn't have to fight just to exist? The envelope sat on the kitchen counter for 3 hours before Maya touched it. She'd seen it when she came home from her shift at the hospital, white and official, with the logo of a company she didn't recognize stamped in the corner. Her son Ethan was building something with blocks in the living room, humming the same 4 notes he always hummed when he felt safe, and she didn't want to break that sound. The dishes could wait, the laundry could wait. But the envelope kept pulling her eyes back. And finally, when Ethan went to his room to line up his toy cars in the exact order he needed them in, she picked it up. Her hands were steady. She told herself it was probably nothing, maybe a notice about building maintenance or a rent increase she could manage if she picked up an extra shift. But the weight of it felt wrong, too thick, too formal, and when she turned it over, she saw her name typed in a font that looked like it came from a lawyer's office. She opened it standing up because sitting down felt like admitting something. The first line said, "Notice of lease termination," and her brain stumbled over the words like they were in a language she used to know, but had forgotten. 30 days. The building had been sold. All tenants were required to vacate. She read it 3 times, and each time the sentences rearranged themselves into something worse. There was a phone number at the bottom, and a name she didn't recognize, and a paragraph about redevelopment opportunities that sounded like it was written by someone who had never worried about where they would sleep. Her chest tightened, not with panic yet, just with the slow creep of understanding that the life she had built here, the routines Ethan needed, the school 3 blocks away where his teacher finally understood him, all of it was about to be pulled out from under her like a rug she didn't know she was standing on. Ethan called from his room, asking if it was almost time for dinner, and she folded the letter back into the envelope, her movements careful and deliberate, as if putting it away could make it less real. She told him 5 minutes, her voice coming out normal, and she hated how easy it was to lie to him with her tone, while her mind was already racing through impossible math. First month's rent, last month's rent, security deposit, application fees. She'd been late on the electric bill twice this year. Her credit score was a number she tried not to think about, and Ethan couldn't just move anywhere. He needed time to adjust to new spaces, new sounds, new light coming through different windows. The last time they'd moved, when he was 6, he didn't sleep for 2 weeks, and she'd had to take unpaid leave from work to stay home with him, which meant falling behind on everything else, which meant eating rice and beans for a month and ignoring the phone when the debt collectors called. She walked to his room and stood in the doorway, watching him arrange his cars by color, then by size, then by color again. He didn't look up. He was wearing his favorite shirt, the blue one with the worn collar that she'd tried to replace once, but he wouldn't touch the new one because it didn't feel the same. His hair needed cutting, but the barber shop made him anxious, so she'd been putting it off, and now she wondered if she'd have to find a new barber too, in a new neighborhood, and teach him all over again that it was safe. He looked so small, sitting cross-legged on the floor, his whole world contained in a 10-foot radius of objects he trusted. She thought about the letter, about the 30 days, about the phone number she'd have to call tomorrow, and something cold settled in her stomach. This wasn't just about finding a new apartment. This was about protecting the one person who couldn't protect himself from the chaos she was about to drag him into. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out, grateful for the distraction. It was a text from her neighbor, Daniel, the man who lived in the apartment next to hers. They'd exchanged maybe 20 words in the 2 years she'd lived here, most of them polite nods in the hallway or quick small talk while checking the mail. The text said, "Did you get a letter today?" She stared at the words, her pulse picking up. She typed back, "Yes." "You too?" 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. His response came slowly, like he was choosing each word with care. "I don't understand what it means. Can we talk?" She looked at Ethan, still absorbed in his cars, and then back at her phone. Something about the way Daniel had phrased it, the blunt honesty of, "I don't understand," made her chest loosen just slightly. She wasn't the only one. Whatever this was, she wasn't alone in it. She texted back, "Tomorrow morning, 9?" And his reply came immediately, "Yes, thank you." She slipped the phone back into her pocket and went to the kitchen to start dinner, moving through the motions of boiling pasta and heating sauce, her mind only half on the task. The letter was still on the counter, and every time she glanced at it, she felt the weight of it pressing down on her like a hand on her shoulder. 30 days. She'd survived worse, she told herself. She'd left Ethan's father when Ethan was 2, had moved across the state with $700 and a car that barely ran, had worked double shifts while pregnant and alone and terrified. She'd figured it out then. She'd figure it out now. But the difference was that back then, she'd only had herself to worry about. Now she had Ethan. And Ethan needed things she couldn't always give him, and the thought of failing him made her hands shake as she stirred the sauce. Dinner was quiet. Ethan ate his pasta in exactly 12 bites, the way he always did, and then asked if he could watch his show, the one about trains that he'd seen 100 times. She said yes, and while he sat on the couch, his eyes locked on the screen, she pulled out her laptop and started searching for apartments in their price range. The results were brutal. Everything was either too expensive, too far from Ethan's school, or already rented. She opened a new tab and searched for tenant rights, for eviction laws, for anything that could buy her more time. But the words blurred together, and she realized she was too tired to absorb any of it. She closed the laptop and sat in the dark kitchen, listening to the sound of the TV in the other room, and let herself feel, just for a minute, the full weight of how scared she was. When she finally got Ethan to bed, after the usual routine of brushing teeth, reading the same book, checking that his nightlight was on, and his door was open exactly 6 inches, she went back to the kitchen and picked up the letter again. She read it one more time, and this time she noticed something she'd missed before. A line near the bottom that said, "Community meeting scheduled for Wednesday, 6 p.m., building lobby, 2 days from now." She didn't know what good a meeting would do, didn't know if anyone would listen or care, but it was something. It was a place to start. She folded the letter and put it in her purse so she wouldn't forget, and then she stood at the sink and washed the dishes, her hands moving in slow, steady circles, and tried to convince herself that everything would be okay. But as she dried the last plate and put it away, she caught her reflection in the window above the sink, her face pale and exhausted, and she thought about Daniel's text. "I don't understand what it means." She didn't fully understand it either, not yet, but she had a feeling she was about to, and she had a feeling it was going to be worse than she imagined. She turned off the kitchen light and walked to her bedroom, where she lay down on top of the covers and stared at the ceiling, her mind already running through scenarios, through plans, through the impossible choices she might have to make. 30 days, 4 weeks, not enough time, never enough time. She thought about calling her sister, the one who lived 2 states away and always had advice that sounded good but never quite fit Maya's life. She thought about calling her manager at the hospital, asking for more hours, even though she was already working 50 a week. She thought about calling the number on the letter, demanding answers, demanding fairness, demanding something other than this quiet, polite destruction of everything she'd built. But instead, she closed her eyes and listened to the sound of Ethan breathing in the next room, steady and even, and she made herself a promise. Whatever happened, she wouldn't let him see her break. She wouldn't let him feel the fear that was crawling up her throat. She would figure this out, the way she always figured things out, even if it meant swallowing every bit of pride she had left. The room was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the occasional car passing outside. She turned onto her side and pulled the blanket up to her chin, and as she drifted towards sleep, her last thought was of the meeting on Wednesday, of all the other tenants who must have gotten the same letter, of whether any of them felt as helpless as she did. And somewhere in the building she knew, Daniel was awake too, staring at his own copy of the letter, trying to make sense of words that didn't make sense, trying to understand why the place he called home was being taken away. She didn't know him, not really, but in that moment, she felt connected to him in a way that made the loneliness just a little more bearable. They were both in this, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. Have you ever gotten news that changed everything in an instant? What did you do first? Let me know in the comments below. Maya woke up at 5:30, an hour before her alarm, her mind already moving through the day ahead. She made coffee in the dark, the machine hissing and gurgling, filling the apartment with a smell that usually felt like comfort, but today just reminded her she was awake too early with too much to worry about. The letter was still in her purse, and she could feel its presence like a weight in the room, even though she couldn't see it. She thought about the meeting with Daniel at 9, about what she would say, about whether he was as scared as she was, or if his confusion meant something else entirely. Ethan's morning routine started at 6:45, exactly, and Maya had learned not to deviate from it by even a minute. He needed his cereal in the blue bowl, his juice in the cup with the stripe, his socks pulled up to the same height on both feet. She moved through the steps automatically, her hands busy, while her mind churned through rental listings and budget calculations that didn't add up no matter how many times she ran them. He ate in silence, counting his spoonfuls under his breath, and she wondered if he could sense her tension, if it was leaking into the air between them like smoke. At 8:30, after she'd walked Ethan to the bus stop and watched him climb on without looking back, she returned to the building and knocked on Daniel's door. He opened it quickly, like he'd been waiting right there, and she was struck by how tall he was, how his eyes didn't quite meet hers, but instead fixed somewhere near her left shoulder. His apartment was neat in a way that felt intentional, everything lined up, nothing out of place, and she noticed he had the same cereal as Ethan, the same brand, sitting on his counter in a perfect row with 3 other boxes. He gestured for her to sit at his small kitchen table, and she did, watching as he pulled out his own copy of the letter, unfolded it with careful precision, and laid it flat between them. His hands were shaking slightly, and she realized he was more anxious than she'd expected. He said the words slowly, like he was translating from another language. "They want us to leave. But I've been here for 8 years. My mother signed the lease before she died. I don't understand why they can make me go." His voice was flat, factual, but there was something underneath it that sounded like panic being held down with both hands. Maya explained what she understood, about the building being sold, about new ownership, about legal rights that probably didn't matter when the people with money had already made their decision. Daniel listened without interrupting, his eyes moving across her face in quick, darting movements, and when she finished, he said something that surprised her. "There are 42 units in this building. If everyone got the same letter, that's 42 families being displaced. That's statistically significant. Someone should care about that." She hadn't thought about it in those terms, hadn't counted, and the number hit her differently when he said it out loud. He pulled out a notebook, spiral-bound and filled with precise handwriting, and she saw he'd already started making lists, names of tenants he recognized, questions about the law, facts he'd looked up about tenant rights and housing codes. He'd highlighted sections in different colors, and she realized his way of coping with confusion was to organize it, to turn chaos into data. He said, "The meeting is Wednesday. I think we should go together. I'm not good at talking to groups, but I'm good at remembering things. You could speak, and I could give you the information." It wasn't a partnership she'd expected, but it made sense in a way that felt right. She agreed, and they spent the next hour going through what he'd found, his finger tracing lines of text while he explained zoning laws and redevelopment clauses in a voice that never changed tone but somehow conveyed urgency. Maya took notes on her phone, her thumbs flying, and she felt something shift inside her, the helplessness starting to crack just slightly. They weren't going to win, probably, but at least they were doing something. At least she wasn't sitting alone in her kitchen, drowning in worst-case scenarios. When she finally stood to leave, Daniel walked her to the door and said, "Thank you for not treating me like I'm stupid." She stopped, caught off guard, and told him she'd never thought that. He nodded once and closed the door. Back in her apartment, Maya looked at her phone and saw 3 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize. No voicemail. She called back, and a woman answered, professional and clipped, identifying herself as a representative from Crestwood Development Group. Maya's stomach dropped. The woman said they were calling all tenants to offer assistance with the transition, and wondered if Maya had time to discuss her options. The word options felt like a trap, but Maya said yes, and the woman launched into a script about relocation resources and moving stipends that sounded generous until Maya did the math in her head and realized it wouldn't cover even half of what she'd need. The woman asked about her employment, her family size, her current rent, and Maya answered, feeling like she was being catalogued, sorted into a database of people who didn't matter enough to keep around. Then the woman said something that made Maya's blood run cold. "I see you have a son, enrolled at Lincoln Elementary. We have information about schools in more affordable areas that might be a better fit." The casual way she said it, like moving Ethan to a new school, was just a minor inconvenience. Like his routine and his teacher and his safe space were interchangeable parts, made Maya's hand tighten around the phone. She said thank you through clenched teeth and ended the call before she said something she'd regret. She sat on the couch, her heart pounding, and pulled up her text thread with her sister. She typed out the whole situation, her thumbs shaking, and hit send before she could second-guess it. The reply came 20 minutes later. "That's awful. Can you stay with me for a bit while you figure it out?" Maya stared at the words. Her sister lived in a small town 4 hours away, with no job opportunities, no school for Ethan that could handle his needs, no life for Maya beyond waiting tables and starting over from nothing. It was an option, technically, but it felt like giving up. She typed back, "Thanks, but I need to stay here," and didn't elaborate. Wednesday came faster than she wanted. Maya put on her best work clothes, the ones she wore to parent-teacher conferences, and met Daniel in the lobby at 5:45. Other tenants were already gathering, faces she recognized but had never spoken to. An elderly couple holding hands, a young woman with a baby on her hip, a man in a wheelchair. She felt the weight of all of them, all those lives packed into one building, and wondered if the people from Crestwood Development Group would even see them as human. Daniel stood next to her, his notebook clutched to his chest, and when the representatives walked in at 6 exactly, sharply dressed and carrying tablets, Maya felt her resolve harden into something she didn't have a name for yet. The lobby felt smaller with everyone packed in, chairs borrowed from apartments and lined up in uneven rows, facing a folding table where the Crestwood representatives had set up their presentation. Maya counted 31 people, some standing against the walls, some sitting with children squirming in their laps. Daniel was beside her, his leg bouncing in a rhythm she recognized as anxiety, and she wanted to tell him it would be okay, but didn't believe it enough herself to say it out loud. The air smelled like someone's perfume, mixed with the building's old radiator heat, and she could hear Mrs. Chen from the 3rd floor coughing into a tissue. A man in a grey suit stood up and introduced himself as Marcus Reed, Senior Acquisitions Manager, and the woman next to him as Jennifer Alcott, Community Liaison. The titles sounded important and empty at the same time. Marcus smiled like he'd practiced it in a mirror and began talking about opportunity, about transformation, about bringing the neighborhood into the modern era. He kept saying, "we," like he and the tenants were on the same team, and every time he did, Maya felt her jaw tighten. Jennifer tapped on her tablet and pulled up slides on a portable screen, showing architectural renderings of sleek buildings with rooftop gardens and floor-to-ceiling windows that probably cost more per month than Maya made in 6. Marcus explained the timeline using words like transition period and phased relocation that were just corporate ways of saying they had 30 days to disappear. He mentioned the relocation assistance, the same number the woman on the phone had quoted, and presented it like a gift they should be grateful for. Maya watched the faces around her, saw people doing the same math she'd done, saw the quiet realization settling in that this wasn't assistance, it was a payoff to make them go away quietly. A man in the back raised his hand and asked if there was any possibility of extending the timeline, and Marcus said regretfully, "No, the construction schedule was locked in." Mrs. Chen stood up, her voice wavering but determined, and said she'd lived in this building for 40 years, that her husband had died in their apartment, that she had nowhere else to go. Jennifer nodded sympathetically and said they understood how difficult change could be, that they had a list of senior housing facilities that might be appropriate, and the word facilities hung in the air like an insult. Maya felt something crack inside her chest. The young woman with the baby asked about staying in the neighborhood, about other buildings owned by Crestwood, and Marcus said, unfortunately, all their properties were market rate, which meant unaffordable, which meant no. The questions kept coming, each one met with the same polite deflection, the same rehearsed sympathy that didn't cost them anything. Maya's turn came when she asked about school stability for children, about the research showing how displacement affected kids with special needs, and Marcus said they were deeply concerned about families, which was why they were offering resources to help with the transition. She wanted to ask what resources, wanted to make him say out loud that there was nothing, but Daniel's hand suddenly gripped her wrist, and she looked over to see him staring at the screen, at the numbers in the corner of one of the slides. He didn't raise his hand. He just stood up, and the room went quiet because there was something about the way he moved, deliberate and focused, that demanded attention. Marcus paused mid-sentence, and Jennifer looked up from her tablet, and Daniel said in his flat, measured voice, "The rendering on slide 7 shows a building with 83 units. This building has 42. That's a 97% increase in density. The parking lot can support 31 vehicles currently. Your plan shows 14 spaces. Where are the other residents supposed to park?" It wasn't the question Maya expected, and it wasn't the question Marcus expected either, because he blinked and looked at Jennifer, who looked at her tablet like the answer might be there. Marcus recovered quickly and said parking wasn't finalized, that they were exploring public transportation options, and Daniel cut him off. "The nearest bus stop is 7 blocks away. The route runs every 45 minutes during peak hours and stops at 9 p.m. 68% of current residents are over 55 or have mobility issues. How is that a viable transportation option?" The numbers came out of him like he'd memorized them, and Maya realized he probably had, that his brain worked in data the way hers worked in emotions. Jennifer started to respond, something about community feedback being valued, but Daniel wasn't done. He pulled out his notebook, flipped to a marked page, and read, "Average rent in this building is $912. Average rent for a 1-bedroom apartment within a 3-mile radius is $1,840. Median income for residents here is $28,000 annually. That's a 67% gap between current housing costs and available alternatives. Your relocation assistance of $3,000 covers 1.6 months of rent at market rate. Where do people go after that? The room was completely silent now, everyone staring at Daniel, and Maya saw something she hadn't seen before. People leaning forward, listening, believing. Marcus tried to redirect, talking about economic development and job creation. But Daniel interrupted again. Job creation for whom? Construction jobs are temporary. The retail and service positions in your plan require experience in hospitality and customer service. 71% of residents here work in manufacturing, healthcare support, or manual labor. Those aren't transferable skill sets. You're not creating opportunities for the people you're displacing, you're replacing them. Titi, his voice never rose, never wavered, but every word landed like a stone, and Maya watched Marcus's smile finally slip, just for a second, before he caught it and put it back in place. Someone in the crowd said, "That's right," and someone else clapped, just once. And suddenly the energy in the room shifted. People started talking over each other, asking harder questions, demanding real answers instead of corporate speak. Jennifer held up her hands, trying to regain control, but it was too late. The performance was over. Maya looked at Daniel, still standing, his notebook open, his face expressionless, but his hands shaking slightly, and she felt something like hope mixed with fear. He'd cracked the facade, but she didn't know what came next. Didn't know if they'd just made things better or worse. Marcus stood up, his professional mask firmly back in place, and said they appreciated the feedback, that all concerns would be taken into consideration, that there would be additional meetings before the transition date. But the way he said it felt final, like a door closing, and when he and Jennifer started packing up their materials, people began standing, some walking out angry, some staying to talk in small groups. Maya turned to Daniel and said, "How did you know all that?" And he shrugged, his eyes still on his notebook. He said, "I looked it up. Numbers don't lie. People do." She didn't know if he meant Marcus and Jennifer or people in general, but it didn't matter because he was right either way. They walked out together, and in the hallway, Mrs. Chen stopped them, her eyes wet. She took Daniel's hand, the gesture clearly making him uncomfortable, but he didn't pull away. She said, "Thank you," and he nodded once, and then gently extracted his hand. Maya watched him retreat into his apartment without another word, and she stood there, her back against the wall, feeling the weight of what had just happened. They hadn't won. They hadn't changed anything, but something had shifted, and she could feel it in her bones, a strange mix of pride and terror, because now the people with power knew they weren't going to disappear quietly. Her phone buzzed, a text from the unknown number that had called before. "Miss Torres, we'd like to discuss your individual situation in private. Please call at your earliest convenience." She stared at it, her stomach turning, because she knew what that meant. They were going to try to pick them off one by one, offer deals, make promises, divide them. She deleted the text and walked back to her apartment, where Ethan was waiting with his homework spread on the table. And she made herself smile, made herself present, made herself forget for just a few hours that their world was ending in 27 days. But later, after Ethan was asleep, she sat in the dark and thought about Daniel's question, "Where do people go?" And she realized she didn't have an answer, not for Mrs. Chen, not for the man in the wheelchair, not for herself. The only thing she knew was that she wasn't going to let them disappear her without a fight. She just didn't know yet what that fight looked like, or if it would cost her more than she could afford to lose. Maya found the flyer slipped under her door on Thursday morning, printed on plain white paper with text that looked like it had been typed on an old computer. "Tenant meeting, Saturday, 10 a.m., apartment 312. Come if you want to fight back." No signature, no name, just the apartment number she recognized as belonging to the man in the wheelchair, someone she'd seen in the lobby, but never spoken to. She held the paper, wondering if this was hope or desperation, and decided it didn't matter because she had nothing left to lose except the 24 days remaining on her eviction notice. Saturday came cold and grey, the kind of morning where the sky pressed down heavy and turned everything the colour of old concrete. Maya knocked on Daniel's door at 9:45 and found him already dressed, his notebook under his arm, looking like he'd been ready for an hour. They walked up 2 flights together in silence, and when they reached 312, the door was already open, voices spilling out into the hallway. Inside, the apartment was smaller than hers, but packed with people sitting on the couch, the floor, standing against the walls. She counted 19, maybe 20, and recognized most of them from the lobby meeting. The man in the wheelchair was named Marcus, not the same Marcus from Crestwood, but the irony wasn't lost on anyone. And he'd set up his living room like a war room with papers taped to the walls, showing timelines and tenant rights documentation. He had a legal pad covered in handwriting and a laptop open to a website about housing advocacy. When everyone settled, he didn't waste time on pleasantries. He said, "Their betting will roll over. I say we prove them wrong." His voice carried the kind of authority that came from someone who'd fought systems before and knew exactly how dirty they played. A woman Maya didn't know, younger, maybe mid-20s with purple streaks in her hair, said she'd been researching and found cases where tenant unions had delayed evictions, sometimes for months, by filing complaints with the housing authority about code violations. Marcus nodded and said he'd already started documenting problems in the building, the broken heating in the east wing, the water damage in the basement laundry room, the fire escape on the 4th floor that hadn't been inspected in 3 years. Mrs. Chen added that the elevator had been broken twice in the past month, and suddenly everyone was talking at once, adding to the list, turning their complaints into ammunition. Daniel sat on the floor near the window, writing everything down, his hand moving steadily across the page while voices overlapped around him. Maya watched him absorb it all, his face calm even as the room heated up with anger and planning. Someone suggested calling the local news, and someone else said they'd tried that already, that reporters didn't care about poor people losing housing unless there was something sensational to film. The purple-haired woman, who introduced herself as Simone, said they needed to make it sensational then, needed to create a story the media couldn't ignore. Marcus pulled up a website on his laptop and turned it around to show the group. It was a GoFundMe page titled "Save Our Homes, Families versus Corporate Greed," with a goal of $50,000 for legal fees and emergency housing assistance. He'd started it the night after the lobby meeting and already had $800 from people Maya didn't recognize, strangers who'd seen the link shared on social media. She felt something twist in her chest, a mix of gratitude and shame, because she'd never imagined asking strangers for help, had spent her whole life trying to handle things alone. The conversation turned to lawyers, and Marcus said he'd contacted 3 firms that did pro bono housing work, but all of them said the same thing. Without proof of illegal eviction practices or discrimination, there wasn't much legal ground to stand on. The building had been sold legally, the notices were properly filed, and 30 days was technically adequate notice under state law. It was a system designed to protect property owners, not tenants, and the unfairness of it sat in the room like smoke. Someone asked what the point was then, if they couldn't win. And Simone said winning wasn't just about staying, it was about making Crestwood's victory cost them something. She explained that public pressure could force concessions, that bad press could hurt their future developments, that even if they lost this building, they could set a precedent that made the next fight easier for the next group of people. It was a long game, and Maya wasn't sure she had the energy for a long game when Ethan needed stability now, not someday. But then Mrs. Chen spoke up, her voice quiet but firm, and said her daughter had called from Seattle offering to let her move in, but she didn't want to leave, didn't want to spend her final years in a city she didn't know. She said, "I'd rather fight and lose here than give up and survive somewhere else." The words settled over the group, and Maya saw heads nodding, saw the shift from despair to determination. Daniel looked up from his notebook and said, "If we're going to fight, we need to be strategic. They have lawyers and money. We have numbers and time. We use what we have." He flipped to a fresh page and started outlining a plan, his voice steady and logical. "Document every code violation. File complaints with every relevant city department. Contact every journalist, blogger, and activist who might care. Show up at city council meetings. Make noise. Make them see us." Marcus added that they needed to organize formally, elect representatives, create a communication system so everyone stayed informed. They passed around a sign-up sheet for a phone tree, and Maya wrote her number down, feeling the weight of commitment settle on her shoulders. They agreed to meet every Saturday, to divide tasks, to hold each other accountable. As people started to leave, exchanging phone numbers and promising to follow up, Maya felt something she hadn't felt in weeks, like she wasn't drowning alone, like maybe there was a rope she could grab onto, even if she didn't know where it led. Daniel walked out with her, and in the stairwell he said, "I've never been part of something like this before. I don't know if I'll be good at it." Maya stopped on the landing and looked at him, this man who'd memorized housing statistics and spoke in facts when everyone else spoke in feelings. And she said, "You were good at it on Wednesday. You made them listen." He considered this, his eyes focused somewhere past her shoulder, and then he said, "They listened because I told the truth. They're used to people being emotional. They're not used to people being right." She smiled despite everything, and they walked down the rest of the stairs together, two people who'd barely known each other a week ago, now bound by the shared knowledge that their home was being taken and they were going to make someone pay attention. The city council meeting was held in a building downtown that smelled like floor polish and old wood, with high ceilings that made every sound echo. Maya had never been to one before, and the formality of it intimidated her. The raised platform where council members sat, the microphone at a podium facing them, the rows of chairs filled mostly with people in business suits carrying leather folders. She sat in the back with Daniel, Marcus, Mrs. Chen and Simone, all of them dressed in their best clothes, looking out of place among the developers and city planners who clearly did this every week. They'd submitted a request to speak during public comment, and Maya's name was 7th on the list. She watched the first 6 people go up. A man complaining about potholes, a woman advocating for a new dog park, a business owner asking for permit extensions. Each got 3 minutes, timed by a digital clock on the wall that beeped when time expired. The council members barely looked up, tapping on tablets or whispering to each other, and Maya's stomach knotted tighter with each passing speaker. When her name was called, she stood on legs that felt unsteady and walked to the microphone, acutely aware of Daniel and the others watching. She'd practiced what to say, had written notes on her phone, but standing there under the fluorescent lights with 5 council members staring down at her, the words tangled in her throat. She started by introducing herself, saying she lived at Maple Court Apartments, that she was a single mother, that she worked at County General Hospital. Her voice sounded too loud in her own ears, amplified and strange. She explained the eviction, the 30-day notice, the inadequate relocation assistance. And as she spoke, she saw one council member, a woman with silver hair, actually put down her tablet and listen. Maya talked about Ethan, about his school, about how autism meant he needed routine and predictability, and how uprooting him would undo years of progress. She didn't say the word autism directly, just described what he needed, and she watched the council members' faces, trying to read whether any of this mattered to them. The clock beeped at 2 minutes, and she rushed through her final point, that 42 families were being displaced to build luxury housing nobody in the neighborhood could afford, that this was happening all over the city, that someone needed to care. The final beep cut her off mid-sentence, and she stepped back from the microphone, her hands shaking. Daniel went next, and he didn't introduce himself beyond his name. He pulled out his notebook and read statistics, displacement rates, affordability gaps, demographic data about the neighborhood. He cited city housing codes that Crestwood's development might violate, mentioned environmental impact studies that hadn't been filed, listed tax incentives the company was receiving while contributing nothing back to the community. His 3 minutes were a surgical dismantling of the project's legitimacy, delivered in a monotone that somehow made it more devastating. When the beep sounded, he closed his notebook, said, "Thank you for your time," and walked back to his seat without waiting for a response. The silver-haired council member, whose nameplate read Councilwoman Diaz, leaned forward and asked if anyone from Crestwood Development was present to respond. A man stood up from the front row, impeccably dressed, and introduced himself as Jonathan Reeves, legal counsel for Crestwood. He walked to the microphone with the ease of someone who'd done this 100 times, and his voice was smooth, reasonable, almost friendly. He expressed sympathy for the residents' concerns, but emphasized that all procedures had been followed legally, that the development would bring jobs and revenue to the city, that displacement was unfortunate but necessary for progress. He talked about the relocation assistance like it was generous, about the housing market like it was beyond Crestwood's control, about the future of the neighborhood in glowing terms that erased everyone currently living there. Maya felt her fingernails digging into her palms. Councilwoman Diaz asked about extending the eviction timeline, and Reeves said regretfully that construction schedules were binding contracts, that delays would cost millions, that the company had already made significant financial commitments. Another council member asked about affordable housing units in the new development, and Reeves smiled and said they were exploring options, but couldn't make promises that weren't economically viable. The public comment period ended, and the council moved on to other business, zoning variances, budget amendments, things that had nothing to do with Maya's life falling apart. She sat there, watching them discuss parking garage specifications while her home disappeared, and felt the full weight of how little power she actually had. They'd listened politely, nodded sympathetically, and nothing had changed. As the meeting dragged on, Marcus leaned over and whispered that they should leave, that there was nothing more to gain here, and Maya stood up, her legs stiff from sitting too still for too long. Outside, the night air was cold and sharp, and Maya pulled her jacket tighter while the group gathered on the sidewalk. Simone was already on her phone, typing furiously, and she looked up to say she'd recorded Daniel's testimony and was posting it online with hashtags about housing justice and corporate greed. Mrs. Chen looked tired, smaller somehow, and Maya asked if she was okay. The old woman nodded but didn't speak, and Maya understood that sometimes there were no words for the exhaustion of fighting a system that didn't want you to win. Daniel stood apart from the group, staring back at the building, and Maya walked over to him. He said without looking at her, "I gave them the facts. The facts should matter, but they're going to approve the development anyway because the company has money and we don't." There was no emotion in his voice, just observation, but Maya heard the disappointment underneath. She said, "You made Councilwoman Diaz listen. That's something." He turned to her then, his eyes meeting hers for just a second before skittering away, and he said, "Listening isn't the same as acting. I know the difference." They walked back to the parking garage in silence, and Maya drove Daniel, Marcus, and Mrs. Chen back to the building because none of them had cars. The radio played softly, some song about heartbreak, and nobody spoke. When they pulled up outside Maple Court, the building looked the same as always, tired but familiar, and Maya wondered how many more times she'd see it before she had to leave. Marcus said they'd meet again Saturday, that this was just the beginning. But his voice lacked the fire it had in his apartment. They were all learning the same lesson, that being right didn't mean winning, and that the system was designed to make them give up long before they ran out of fight. The second meeting with Crestwood was scheduled for Thursday at 6, this time in a conference room at their downtown office instead of the building lobby. Maya didn't know if the change of location was meant to intimidate them or just a power move, but either way, it worked. The office was on the 14th floor of a glass tower, all polished marble and abstract art in the lobby, with a receptionist who looked at their group like they'd tracked mud across an expensive carpet. Marcus, Daniel, Maya, Simone, Mrs. Chen, and 4 other tenants signed in and were led to a room with a long table and ergonomic chairs that probably cost more than Maya's monthly rent. Jennifer Alcott was already there, along with Jonathan Reeves, and a woman introduced as Dr. Patricia Hammond, Community Impact Consultant. The title sounded made up, designed to make displacement sound like a science with ethical oversight. They offered coffee and water in glass bottles, and nobody took any because it felt like accepting something from people who were trying to erase them. Jennifer started with the same sympathetic smile from before, saying they'd heard the concerns raised at the city council meeting and wanted to have a productive dialogue about solutions. The word solutions hung in the air, heavy with the implication that the problem was the tenants, not the eviction. Dr. Hammond took over, pulling up a presentation on a wall-mounted screen that showed statistics about neighborhood revitalization and economic growth. She used phrases like community stakeholders and sustainable development and inclusive prosperity that meant nothing when translated into actual human lives. She talked about job training programs Crestwood was partnering with, about tenant placement services they were funding, about their commitment to responsible development. Maya watched Daniel's jaw tighten with each slide, watched him writing in his notebook with increasing pressure until the pen nearly tore through the paper. Jonathan Reeves addressed the timeline concerns, explaining that they'd secured a small extension, an additional 2 weeks beyond the original 30 days, as a gesture of good faith. He presented it like a gift, and Maya did the math. 44 days total to find housing, pack up her life, transfer Ethan to a new school, and somehow make it all feel normal to a child who couldn't handle the grocery store changing its layout. Mrs. Chen asked what happened if people couldn't find housing in that time, and Reeves said they had partnerships with temporary housing facilities. And there was that word again, facilities, stripped of humanity. Simone started asking pointed questions about the affordable housing requirements in the city's development code, about whether Crestwood had applied for exemptions, about what percentage of the new building would be accessible to current median income levels. Jennifer deferred to Reeves, who deferred to Dr. Hammond, who pulled up a slide showing that 8% of units would be designated workforce housing at 20% below market rate, which still meant $1,500 a month, double what most tenants currently paid. The math was designed to look generous on paper while being useless in practice. Daniel had been silent through all of this, his notebook open, his pen still. Maya glanced at him and saw his leg bouncing under the table, that same anxious rhythm from before, but his face was completely blank. She'd learned to read his stillness as the opposite of calm, as the moment before he couldn't hold back anymore. Jennifer was mid-sentence about relocation timelines when Daniel stood up, the chair scraping loud against the floor, and everyone stopped. He didn't ask permission to speak. He walked to the front of the room, stood next to the screen showing Dr. Hammond's carefully crafted statistics and said, "Everything you've presented is a lie by omission." The room went cold. Reeves started to object, but Daniel talked over him, his voice flat and precise. "You said 8% workforce housing. That's 7 units out of 83. There are 42 families being displaced. Even if all 7 units went to current tenants, which they won't, because you'll use a lottery system to avoid accusations of preferential treatment, that leaves 35 families with nowhere to go. You're not offering solutions. You're offering the appearance of solutions while ensuring the outcome you want. He flipped open his notebook and read, "Average wait time for housing assistance in this county is 11 months. Homeless shelter capacity is at 104%. You know this. You factored it into your timeline. You chose 30 days because you know most people will be too overwhelmed to organize resistance." Dr. Hammond tried to interrupt, saying his numbers were taken out of context, but Daniel kept going. "The job training programs you mentioned are run by Bridgepoint Workforce Development. I called them. They have a 6-month wait list and require participants to have reliable transportation and childcare, which most displaced tenants won't have because you're forcing them to move away from their support systems. The temporary housing facilities are emergency shelters with a 14-day maximum stay and a 6 p.m. curfew. You're presenting them as viable options for people with jobs, with children in school, with disabilities that require stability. That's not a solution. That's designed failure." Jennifer's smile was completely gone now. She said something about appreciating his research but needing to keep the conversation constructive, and Daniel turned to look at her directly, which Maya had rarely seen him do with anyone. He said, "This isn't a conversation. Conversations require equal power. You have lawyers, money, and the city council's approval. We have 6 weeks before we're homeless. You're not here to find solutions. You're here to document that you tried, so that when people ask why you destroyed a community, you can say you held meetings." The words landed like punches, and Maya saw Reeves whisper something to Jennifer, saw Dr. Hammond close her laptop. Reeves stood up, his professional mask slipping just enough to show irritation underneath, and said they'd invited the tenants here in good faith, that this hostility wasn't productive, that if the group couldn't engage respectfully, perhaps they should reschedule. Daniel didn't move. He said, "You're uncomfortable because I'm stating facts. Facts aren't hostile. They're just true. The hostile act is evicting 42 families to build housing they can't afford. The hostile act is calling it community development when you're destroying the community that exists. I'm autistic. I don't understand why people prioritize politeness over honesty, but I understand you're hoping we'll be polite enough to disappear quietly." The silence that followed was absolute. Maya felt her heart pounding, felt the weight of every eye in the room, felt the shift in air pressure like before a storm. Mrs. Chen was crying silently, and Marcus had his hand over his mouth, and Simone was recording on her phone, held low but steady. Jennifer started to say something about moving forward, but her voice had lost its confidence. Daniel closed his notebook, walked back to his chair, and sat down. He didn't look at anyone. He'd said what he needed to say, and now he was done, retreating back into himself while the room struggled to recover from the truth he'd forced them to acknowledge. Reeves attempted to regain control of the room, clearing his throat and suggesting they take a short break, but Daniel wasn't finished. He opened his notebook again, and Maya realized he'd only paused to let his first statement settle. He flipped to a page marked with a yellow tab and said, "Crestwood Development Group received $4.2 million in tax incentives from the city for this project. That's public record. The incentive was granted under a provision for creating community benefit through mixed-income housing. Your current plan allocates 8% to below-market units. The city code requires 15% for projects receiving public subsidies over $2 million. Jennifer's face flushed, and she exchanged a glance with Reeves that told Maya this wasn't information they'd expected anyone to dig up. Daniel continued, his finger tracing down the page. "You filed for a hardship exemption, claiming the 15% requirement would make the project financially unviable." Your exemption application stated projected profit margins of 4%. But your parent company's last quarterly earnings report, which is also public record, shows average profit margins of 18% across all residential developments. You lied to the city to avoid building affordable housing while taking money meant to create affordable housing. Dr. Hammond tried to interject, saying financial projections were complex and couldn't be reduced to simple comparisons. But Daniel cut her off with a look that was almost pitying. He said, "I have a degree in mathematics. I understand complexity. This isn't complex. This is fraud disguised as business strategy. D." He pulled out printed pages from his notebook and slid them across the table. Maya caught a glimpse of highlighted sections, footnoted references, calculations written in margins. He'd built a case, not just an argument, and the precision of it was making the Crestwood representatives visibly uncomfortable. Marcus leaned forward, picking up where Daniel had created an opening, and said he'd also done research. He'd found 3 other Crestwood developments in neighboring cities with the same pattern: tax incentives requested, affordable housing promises made, exemptions filed, luxury buildings constructed. In one case, tenants had sued and won a settlement, but by then the building was finished, and they were already displaced, scattered to cheaper neighborhoods an hour away. The settlement money didn't bring back their community, didn't undo their children switching schools, didn't restore the life they'd lost. He said it slowly, deliberately, making sure every word landed. Mrs. Chen spoke up then, her voice shaking but clear, and said her daughter had helped her look up property values in the neighborhood. In the past 3 years, while Crestwood had been quietly buying buildings, property assessments had increased by 41%. Rents had followed, pushing out long-time residents before the evictions even started. She said, "You didn't just take our building. You made the whole neighborhood too expensive for people like us. You planned this." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation backed by data, and Jennifer's expression shifted from professional sympathy to something harder. Simone added that she'd contacted a journalist at the city's alternative newspaper, someone who specialized in housing justice issues. The journalist was interested, had already started investigating Crestwood's development history, had requested public records for all their city contracts and tax incentive applications. She said the story would run next week, with or without Crestwood's comment, and she was happy to provide them with quotes from this meeting if they'd like to respond on record. She smiled when she said it, sweet and dangerous, and Maya saw Reeves's jaw tighten. Daniel wasn't done. He flipped to another marked page and said, "The environmental impact assessment filed for this project states the building will displace 0 residents because the property was classified as underutilized commercial space. But this is a residential building with 42 occupied units. That's perjury on a legal document. The assessment also failed to account for increased traffic, strain on local schools, or displacement effects on neighborhood businesses. 3 shops on this block have closed in the past year because their customer base was evicted from Crestwood properties. You're not developing a neighborhood. You're erasing it and calling it progress." The temperature in the room had shifted completely. Jennifer was no longer smiling. Dr. Hammond had stopped taking notes, and Reeves was typing rapidly on his phone, likely messaging someone higher up the chain. Maya felt a strange mixture of exhilaration and terror because they'd backed Crestwood into a corner, but cornered animals bite back. She thought about the text messages she'd been ignoring, the calls from unknown numbers, the feeling that someone was watching the building. They'd made themselves visible, and visibility was dangerous when you had no protection. Reeves finally spoke, his voice carefully controlled, and said that many of the points raised were based on misunderstandings of complex legal and financial matters, that Crestwood had acted in full compliance with all regulations, that they welcomed scrutiny because they had nothing to hide. But his body language betrayed him. The way he wouldn't make eye contact, the tension in his shoulders, the speed at which he gathered his papers. He said they'd need to consult with their legal team before continuing this discussion, that perhaps it would be better to reschedule when everyone had cooled down. Daniel closed his notebook and said, "We don't need to cool down. We need you to follow the law you're using to destroy our homes. We need the city to enforce its own regulations. We need you to tell the truth about what this project actually is. A transfer of wealth from poor people to rich people, subsidized by taxpayer money, rubber-stamped by officials who don't live in the neighborhoods they're sacrificing." He stood up, and the rest of the tenants stood with him, a coordinated movement that felt both planned and spontaneous. Maya grabbed her bag and followed Daniel toward the door. Jennifer called after them, saying they should stay, that walking out wouldn't solve anything, but Marcus turned back and said, "Neither will staying. You've already decided what you're going to do. We just wanted you to know we see exactly what you are." They walked out past the expensive art and the polished receptionist into the elevator that dropped them 14 floors back to street level, and nobody spoke until they were outside. Then Simone let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob, and said, "Holy shit, Daniel, you eviscerated them." Daniel shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention, and said, "I just read their own documents back to them. They eviscerated themselves." Maya didn't expect the call at 2 in the morning. Her phone lit up the dark bedroom, vibrating on the nightstand, and she grabbed it before it could wake Ethan in the next room. The number was Daniel's. He never called, barely texted, and when she answered, the silence on the other end made her stomach drop. Then she heard it. Breathing, uneven and fast, the kind that came before someone couldn't breathe at all. She said his name twice before he responded, his voice tight and small. "I can't stop thinking about where I'm supposed to go." She was out of bed and pulling on clothes before she'd even decided to go, operating on instinct that surprised her. She checked on Ethan, still asleep with his nightlight casting familiar shadows, and wrote a note she left on the kitchen table just in case, though she'd be back before he woke. The hallway was silent and dim, and when she knocked on Daniel's door, it opened immediately, like he'd been standing right there. He looked terrible, pale and drawn, his eyes red-rimmed, and he stepped back to let her in without speaking. His apartment was exactly as organized as always, but he was disintegrating inside it. He sat on the couch, and she sat beside him, close but not touching because she'd learned he needed space even when he needed company. He stared at his hands and said, "My mother died in the hospital, heart attack. She was 53, I was 24. I didn't understand what to do with her apartment, with her things. The social worker helped me find this place. She said it would be mine, that I could make it safe. It took me 2 years before I could sleep through the night here. 3 years before I stopped checking if the door was locked every 15 minutes. His voice was flat, the way it always was. But Maya heard the fractures underneath. He said, "I know every sound this building makes. I know the pattern of footsteps in the apartment above me. I know how the radiator clicks at 6:17 every morning. I know the exact angle of sunlight through my window at every hour of every season. Other people think that's strange, but for me, it's the only way my brain can rest. I can predict this space. I can't predict anywhere else." He looked at her then, and his eyes were desperate in a way that made her chest ache. Maya didn't know what to say, so she just listened, and Daniel kept talking like he'd been holding these words in for years. He told her about the meltdowns he used to have, about sensory overload in new environments, about the time he tried to live in a different apartment and ended up in the emergency room because his anxiety manifested as physical pain. He told her about routines that kept him functional, about the job he'd lost because they moved office locations, and he couldn't adapt fast enough. He told her about loneliness that felt like living underwater, about trying to connect with people who didn't understand why he couldn't just relax, just go with the flow, just be normal. He said, At the meeting today, when I was talking to those people from Crestwood, I felt something I've never felt before. I was angry. I'm not supposed to be good at anger. I don't always recognize emotions in real time. But I knew this was anger because it made my hands shake and my voice want to break, and I had to use every piece of control I have to keep speaking in straight lines. I was angry because they were lying and pretending it was kindness. I was angry because Mrs. Chen was crying. I was angry because your son is going to lose his school and his routine just like I'm losing mine, and nobody with power cares. Maya felt tears on her face and didn't remember starting to cry. She said, "You were incredible today. You made them see us." Daniel shook his head, a sharp movement, and said, "They saw us and decided we didn't matter. That's worse than being invisible. Being seen and dismissed is worse." He pulled his knees up to his chest, making himself smaller, and Maya recognized the gesture as self-protection. She asked if she could hold his hand, giving him the choice, and after a long moment he extended it. His palm was clammy, trembling, and she held it gently. They sat like that in the quiet apartment, and Daniel told her about his mother, about how she'd advocated for him when teachers said he was being difficult, when doctors said he just needed discipline, when the world insisted he was broken instead of different. He said she used to tell him that his brain wasn't wrong, it was just wired for a world that didn't exist yet, and someday people would understand. He said, she was wrong. People don't understand. They tolerate, at best. And now, the one place where I don't have to translate myself into something more acceptable is being taken away. Maya told him about Ethan then, about the diagnosis that came when he was 4, about the years of fighting for services and accommodations, about the guilt she carried for every time she lost her patience, every time she wished things were easier. She told him about Ethan's teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, who finally got it, who didn't try to force him into behaviors that hurt him, who celebrated his differences instead of treating them like deficits. She said, "If we move, I have to start over. I have to find someone else who understands, and most people don't. Most people see him as a problem to fix." Daniel's hand tightened on hers, just slightly, and he said, "He's not a problem. Neither am I. But the world is built for people who aren't us, and when we ask for it to flex, we're told we're asking too much." His voice cracked on the last word, and Maya watched him struggle to hold himself together. She said, "You don't have to hold it together right now. It's just us." And something in him broke, not dramatically, but like a dam with a hairline fracture finally giving way. He cried quietly, his shoulders shaking, and Maya moved closer, asking permission with her body language before putting her arm around him. He let her, and they sat there while he grieved for a home he hadn't lost yet, but knew was already gone. For a mother who'd promised him safety in a world that kept proving otherwise, for a future that felt impossible to imagine. Maya cried too, for Ethan, for herself, for Mrs. Chen and Marcus and everyone in that building who'd built lives in the cracks of a system that didn't value them. When the tears finally stopped, Daniel pulled away and wiped his face with his sleeve, embarrassed. He said, "I'm sorry, I don't usually—" And Maya cut him off. "Don't apologize, not for this." She stayed until sunrise started filtering through his window at the angle he'd told her about, and when she stood to leave, he walked her to the door. He said, "Thank you for coming. I didn't know who else to call." She said, "You can always call me. Whatever happens, we're in this together now." He nodded, and she saw something shift in his expression, like he was filing that promise away in the part of his brain where he kept things he could rely on. She went back to her apartment, slipped into bed for 20 minutes before Ethan's alarm went off, and carried the weight of Daniel's grief alongside her own as she moved through the morning routine that might not survive much longer. The article ran on Wednesday, front page of the City section, with a photo of their building and a headline that read, "Tax-funded development displaces dozens while skirting affordable housing rules." Maya bought 3 copies at the corner store, her hands shaking as she read Simone's quotes, Daniel's statistics, Marcus's history of Crestwood's pattern across the city. The journalist had done exactly what Simone promised, digging into public records and finding discrepancies between what Crestwood told the city and what they'd actually delivered. By noon, the story was being shared online, picking up traction on local news sites and housing advocacy pages. Maya's phone started ringing that afternoon. First, a producer from the local television station asking if she'd be willing to be interviewed. Then a law firm that specialized in housing discrimination saying they'd read the article and wanted to discuss potential legal action. Then the city councilwoman's office, Diaz's assistant calling to schedule a meeting. Each call felt like vindication and danger at the same time, like they'd finally been heard, but had also painted targets on their backs. She saved every voicemail, forwarded every email to Marcus and Simone, and felt the momentum building into something she couldn't quite name yet. Thursday morning, Maya woke to find a letter slipped under her door, not from Crestwood but from building management, informing all tenants that there would be an inspection on Friday for code violations. The timing wasn't coincidental. Someone was responding to their complaints about broken heating and faulty fire escapes by actually documenting them, which meant either the city was taking them seriously or Crestwood was covering their tracks. Maya texted the group, and within an hour they'd organized to be present during the inspection to make sure nothing was overlooked or explained away. The inspection happened at 10 a.m., a city official with a clipboard working through each floor methodically. Daniel followed him with his own notebook, documenting everything the inspector documented, asking questions about code requirements and violation classifications. The official seemed annoyed at first, then impressed, then wary, especially when Daniel pointed out issues the inspector had walked past: exposed wiring in the basement, mold in the third-floor hallway, a broken railing on the back stairwell. By the time they finished, the inspector had filled 4 pages and Daniel had filled 6. Marcus asked when they could expect the report, and the inspector said 2 weeks, standard protocol. That afternoon, Maya got a call from a number she recognized, Jonathan Reeves. Her first instinct was to ignore it, but curiosity won. His voice was different than in the meetings, less polished, almost conciliatory. He said Crestwood had seen the article, had discussed it internally, and wanted to extend an offer. If Maya and 3 other tenant representatives would agree to a private mediation session, Crestwood would be willing to discuss additional relocation assistance and potential priority placement in future affordable housing developments. He emphasized the word private, and Maya understood what he wasn't saying. Stop making noise publicly and we'll negotiate. She told him she'd discuss it with the group and hung up before he could say more. At Saturday's meeting in Marcus's apartment, she relayed the offer, and the room erupted in debate. Some people saw it as progress, proof that pressure was working. Others saw it as a trap, a way to split them apart and silence the ones making the most noise. Simone argued they should demand transparency, insist any negotiations be public record. Mrs. Chen said she was too tired to fight anymore, that maybe taking what they could get was better than ending up with nothing. The fractures were showing, exhaustion and fear pulling them in different directions. Daniel had been quiet through most of the discussion, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, his notebook closed. When Maya asked what he thought, he said, "They're offering just enough to make some of us stop. That's strategy, not compromise. If we take the deal privately, we can't talk about it publicly, which means we can't hold them accountable to whatever they promise. And anyone who doesn't take the deal becomes easier to dismiss because we'll look divided." His logic was airtight, but Maya saw the desperation in other people's faces, the calculation of whether principles mattered when homelessness was 18 days away. They voted, And it was close, 11-8 in favor of rejecting the private mediation and demanding public negotiations with city oversight. The 8 who'd voted yes looked defeated, and Maya knew she'd just lost some of them, that they'd start looking for their own solutions because the collective fight felt too risky. She felt the group splintering even as they agreed to stay unified, and the weight of leadership she'd never asked for pressed down on her shoulders. After the meeting, she found Daniel on the building's front steps, staring at the street, and sat beside him without speaking. He said, "I've been thinking about what happens if we lose. Not if, really, when. Because even if we delay them, even if we force concessions, they're still going to build their building and we're still going to have to leave. So what's the point?" Maya didn't have an answer that wasn't a platitude, so she told him the truth. "I don't know. Maybe there isn't a point beyond making them see us as human. Maybe that's enough." Daniel looked at her, really looked, and said, "It's not enough for me. I need to know that this mattered, that I didn't break myself open in front of strangers for nothing." The words hit Maya hard because she'd been thinking the same thing, wondering if all this effort would amount to anything more than a delay, a footnote in a story that ended the same way regardless. She thought about Ethan, about the conversation she'd have to have with him soon, about packing up his room and watching him process losing another safe space. She thought about Daniel's 2 a.m. phone call, about Mrs. Chen's tears, about the community that had formed in crisis and would scatter in defeat. She said, "Even if we lose the building, we changed something. We made them uncomfortable. We told the truth when they were counting on us to stay quiet. That has to matter." Daniel considered this, his face unreadable in the dim streetlight, and finally said, "I hope you're right. Because if you're not, I gave away pieces of myself I don't know how to get back." They sat in silence after that, watching cars pass and lights turn on in windows across the street, both of them carrying the knowledge that hope was getting harder to hold on to, that the fight was costing more than they'd anticipated, and that surrender was starting to look less like failure and more like survival. Maya's phone buzzed with a text from the TV producer, confirming an interview for Monday, and she wondered if telling their story one more time would change anything or just turn their pain into content for people who'd forget about them by dinner time. The call came on a Tuesday, 11 days before the final eviction date. Maya was at work, running labs on the 3rd floor of the hospital, when her phone lit up with Councilwoman Diaz's office. She stepped into the hallway to answer, her heart already racing because official calls never brought good news. But Diaz's voice was different than expected. Excited even, saying the city council had held an emergency session after the building inspector's report revealed 23 code violations, some dating back years. Crestwood's permits were being suspended, pending a full investigation into whether they'd knowingly purchased a non-compliant building. Maya's hands went numb. She asked what that meant for the eviction, and Diaz explained that without valid permits, construction couldn't proceed, which meant Crestwood had no legal grounds to displace tenants for a project that couldn't move forward. The eviction notices were void, at least temporarily, and the city was requiring Crestwood to bring the building up to code before any development could be approved. Diaz said it carefully, emphasizing temporarily, making sure Maya understood this wasn't victory, just a pause. But a pause meant time, and time meant Ethan could finish the school year, meant Mrs. Chen could stay in the apartment where her husband's memory lived, meant Daniel could keep the sunrise that hit his wall at the angle his brain needed. Maya called Daniel first, her voice breaking as she tried to explain, and he was silent for so long she thought the call had dropped. Then he said, quiet and precise, "How long?" She told him Diaz estimated 6 months minimum for the investigation and compliance process, maybe longer if Crestwood fought it. 6 months, half a year. It wasn't forever, but it was enough to breathe, enough to plan, enough to stop drowning. She heard something in the background, a sound she couldn't identify, and realized Daniel was crying again, but different than last time, something closer to relief than grief. The building erupted that evening. Someone posted the news in the group chat, and within an hour, people were gathering in the lobby, hugging and crying and laughing in that hysterical way that comes after sustained terror finally breaks. Marcus was there in his wheelchair, grinning wider than Maya had ever seen, and Simone was already on her phone, calling the journalist to give him the update. Mrs. Chen sat on the old couch in the corner, her hands folded in her lap, tears streaming down her face while she smiled at nothing in particular. Maya found Daniel standing apart from the crowd, watching, and when their eyes met, he nodded once, and she understood everything that nod contained. But the celebration was complicated by knowledge they all carried. This wasn't over. Crestwood could appeal, could fix the violations and restart the process, could find new legal strategies. The city's investigation might clear them, might find the violations weren't their responsibility. 6 months could become 3, could become nothing if the right pressure was applied in the right places. Maya watched people celebrate and saw some of them already understanding this, already tempering their joy with pragmatism. The fight had just changed shape, not ended, and they'd all aged in ways that made trusting good news feel dangerous. That night, after Ethan was asleep, Maya sat at her kitchen table and finally let herself feel the full weight of what had almost happened. She'd been running on adrenaline and necessity for so long that stopping felt like falling, and the crash was brutal. She thought about all the apartments she'd looked at, the budgets she'd run, the conversations she'd prepared to have with Ethan about moving. She thought about the future she'd been bracing for, one where she worked 3 jobs and they lived somewhere cheaper and farther, and Ethan regressed because she couldn't give him what he needed. That future had receded for now, and the relief was almost painful. Her phone buzzed. Daniel, texting instead of calling. "Can I show you something tomorrow?" She replied yes, curious, and he sent a time, 9 a.m., his apartment. She couldn't sleep that night, her mind too wired, and when morning finally came, she found herself at his door with coffee she'd picked up from the corner shop, the good kind he liked that came in the blue cups. He let her in, and she noticed immediately that his apartment felt different, lighter somehow, like a pressure valve had been released. He led her to his bedroom, and she hesitated at the threshold until he gestured that it was okay. The wall across from his bed was covered in photographs, pinned up in a grid so precise it could only be Daniel's work. Pictures of the building, of the sunrise through his window at different times of year, of the lobby, of the view from the roof. Pictures of tenants, Mrs. Chen watering her plants, Marcus reading in the courtyard, children playing near the entrance. Pictures from the meetings, from the city council, from the morning of the inspection. He'd been documenting everything, creating a record of what they'd almost lost, and in the center of the grid was a photo Maya didn't remember being taken. Her and Daniel on the front steps that night after the last meeting, both of them looking exhausted and determined. He said, "I started taking these when the eviction notice came. I thought I needed to remember what home looked like before I lost it, but now they mean something different. They're evidence that we existed here, that we mattered enough to fight for it." Maya stared at the wall, at the constellation of moments Daniel had preserved, and felt something crack open in her chest. She said, "We did matter. We still do." Daniel nodded, and there was something in his expression she'd never seen before, something that looked almost like peace. The weeks that followed were strange, a collective exhale that nobody quite trusted. People started talking about forming a permanent tenants association, about staying organized even after the immediate crisis passed. Simone was already researching tenant ownership models, ways they could potentially buy the building if Crestwood decided it wasn't worth the fight. Marcus was in touch with housing advocacy groups across the state, learning from other communities that had successfully resisted displacement. Mrs. Chen had started a garden in the courtyard, planting flowers she said would bloom in spring, a small act of faith that spring would come and she'd be there to see it. Maya and Daniel fell into a new routine. Coffee on Saturday mornings, comparing notes about the ongoing investigation, helping each other navigate the bureaucracy of protecting what they'd won. Ethan started spending time with Daniel, fascinated by his rock collection, by the precise way he organized everything, by the fact that Daniel didn't expect him to make eye contact or sit still. Maya watched them together and saw something she'd been searching for without knowing. Community that didn't require her son to be anyone other than who he was. She thought about the sliding door moment of that first eviction notice, how it had led here to people who'd been strangers becoming family forged in crisis. 6 months later, when the city's investigation concluded and Crestwood quietly withdrew their development plans, choosing to sell the building rather than meet compliance requirements, the tenants pooled resources with help from a non-profit housing group and made an offer. It took another 4 months of negotiations, of fundraising, of legal complications that made Maya's head spin. But on a cold morning in February, they signed papers that made them collective owners of the building they'd fought to keep. Daniel stood in the lobby that day, the deed in his hands, and said to no one in particular, "This is still my home, but now it's ours, And for the first time since this all started, Maya let herself believe that some fights, against all odds and logic, were worth winning, not because they changed the system, but because they proved that people the system tried to erase could refuse to disappear. Before you go, I need you to do something for me. If Maya and Daniel's fight reminded you that ordinary people can stand up to systems built to crush them, smash that like button. Subscribe and ring the bell, because these are the stories they don't want told, the voices they hope will stay silent. Now tell me in the comments, if you had 30 days to leave the only place that felt like home, where your kids felt safe, where your routine kept you from falling apart, what would you sacrifice to stay? Have you ever had to choose between fighting back and protecting what little you had left? Drop your story below, because someone reading this needs to know they're not alone in that impossible choice.